This is the story of how a forgotten wallet, a mass mailing scandal, and a Supreme Court decision that almost nobody noticed combined to put Americans $1.277 trillion in debt. Most of the people carrying that debt have no idea how the system was built or who it was actually built for. Before credit cards existed, getting consumer credit meant walking into a bank, sitting across from a loan officer, and making your case in person. Credit was local, limited, and slow, and the idea that you could carry a small piece of plastic and use it anywhere simply hadn't been invented yet. The earliest experiments pointed in that direction, though. Back in the late 1800s, some merchants began issuing credit coins to trusted customers, letting them buy now and pay later. Western Union pushed the concept further in 1914 with what they called metal money. Metal plates handed to select customers who could delay payment until a later date. Then in 1946, a Brooklyn banker named John Biggins created something called the Charget card, the first real bank card, which let customers buy from participating merchants and receive a bill afterward. None of these were credit cards in the way we understand them now, and all of them stayed small, local, and limited to specific merchants or communities. The real turning point came from a forgotten wallet, and it started with an embarrassing dinner. Late in 1949, a businessman named Frank McNamara sat down to dinner in New York City and reached the end of the meal without his wallet. That moment of embarrassment planted an idea, and McNamara came back to the same restaurant in February 1950 with his business partner Ralph Schneider to test it. He paid the bill using a small cardboard card. That dinner became known as the First Supper, and that card became the first Diners Club card. At launch, 27 New York City restaurants accepted it, roughly 200 people used it, and cardholders paid $5 a year for the privilege while merchants paid a 7% fee on every charge. One rule stood above all others. Cardholders had to pay their full balance at the end of every month. No exceptions. By 1951, Diners Club had reached 42,000 members, and the financial industry had seen enough to know this concept had legs. American Express entered the market in 1958, starting with a purple cardboard card before switching to the green plastic version still recognized today. Credit cards were becoming a real business, but they still carried a reputation as a convenience product for the relatively wealthy. That was about to change, starting with an experiment in a mid-sized California city that nobody was paying much attention to. In September 1958, Bank of America launched one of the most audacious financial experiments in American history, and they chose their location with care. Fresno, California had a population of about 250,000, large enough for a credit card program to actually function but small enough to contain the fallout if things fell apart. Bank of America held roughly 45% of the local banking market there, and crucially, the city sat far enough from major media centers that a failure might go unnoticed. On September 18, 1958, Bank of America mailed 65,000 unsolicited credit cards to Fresno residents. Nobody applied for them, nobody requested them, and nobody signed up. They simply arrived in mailboxes, preloaded with credit limits between $300 and $500. This became known as the Fresno Drop. What made the Bank Americard different from anything before it was the revolving balance feature. Cardholders didn't have to pay in full each month. They could carry a balance forward and pay it off over time, which sounded generous until you understood that unpaid balances charged interest, a detail many recipients of those unsolicited cards never fully grasped. Joseph Williams, the man who designed the program, had run the numbers and concluded that delinquency rates would stay below 4%. The actual rate within the first year came in at 22%. Merchants resented the 6% fee they were required to pay. Criminals worked out how to replicate the cards almost immediately, and fraud spread faster than the bank had any plan to handle. Bank of America absorbed losses of nearly $20 million in that first year, and Williams quit before his second anniversary on the project. The bank was rattled enough to publish an open letter to 3 million California households apologizing for the chaos. And yet, by May 1961, the Bank Americard had quietly turned profitable, and Bank of America made a deliberate choice to keep that information secret, letting competitors continue believing the credit card business was still a money-losing disaster. Meanwhile, the drops continued across the country. Bank of America's licensees and competitors adopted the same mass mailing strategy, sending unsolicited cards to Americans who never asked for them, and by the time unsolicited mailings were finally banned in 1970, more than 100 million credit cards had already landed in American mailboxes. The Truth in Lending Act eventually closed that door, but the industry those mailings built was already running. There's a chapter of credit card history that rarely makes it into the origin story, and it concerns who the system excluded from the start. Until 1974, women in the United States couldn't get a credit card without a male cosigner, meaning a husband, father, brother, or uncle had to vouch for them before any credit could be extended. Financial qualifications didn't change that requirement. Congressional hearings held in May 1972 documented case after case of women being turned away not because of their financial history but because of their sex or marital status, with banks routinely interrogating applicants about their plans to marry or have children, using presumed future family obligations as grounds for denial. Margaret Heckler, the only newly elected woman in the 90th Congress in 1967, arrived in Washington as a practicing lawyer and a sitting member of Congress, and she still had no right to credit in her own name. That changed on October 28, 1974, when Congress passed the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, prohibiting creditors from discriminating based on sex or marital status. 2 years later, in 1976, Congress expanded those protections to cover race, color, religion, national origin, and age. That changed on October 28, 1974, when Congress passed the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, prohibiting creditors from discriminating based on sex or marital status. 2 years later, in 1976, Congress expanded those protections to cover race, color, religion, national origin, and age. Northwestern professor Chloe Thurston, reflecting on the law's 50th anniversary, put the scale of what had been normalized in plain terms. We have no idea that these things happened and were so widespread and normalized, and this just wasn't a very long time ago. Changing the law, though, didn't reset the data. Credit scores depend on credit history, and decades of being locked out of the credit system left women, Black Americans, and other communities subjected to redlining and systemic discrimination with thinner credit files and lower scores than their white male counterparts. The doors opened in 1974 and 1976, but the gap those closed doors created didn't close with them. Now we reach the event that reshaped the credit card industry more than any other, and the one most Americans have never heard of. In 1978, the Supreme Court issued a unanimous ruling in a case called Marquette National Bank of Minneapolis versus First of Omaha Service Corporation, and the question at its center sounded dry enough to put a legal scholar to sleep. When a nationally chartered bank in one state lends money to a customer in another state, which state's interest rate limits apply? The court ruled that the bank's home state controlled the terms, not the borrowers. Before that ruling, state usury laws had real power. If your state capped credit card interest at 12%, that cap held, and every consumer in the state had that protection. After Marquette, a bank could simply relocate to a state with no interest rate cap and charge whatever it wanted to customers anywhere in the country. Elizabeth Warren, then a Harvard law professor and later a U.S. senator, described the decision as the single biggest policy change in the credit area, the whole consumer credit area, through an obscure Supreme Court decision interpreting some ambiguous language. Citibank moved first. Squeezed by New York's interest rate limits, the bank approached Bill Janklow, the governor of South Dakota, and offered a straightforward trade. Move our credit card operations to your state, and we bring the jobs with us. Janklow agreed. South Dakota's legislature passed a bill that Citibank had drafted itself repealing the state's interest rate cap, and Citibank's credit card division moved to Sioux Falls, where it remains today. Delaware followed. Other states, competing for jobs during a deep recession, began stripping away their own consumer protections to attract credit card companies, and that deregulatory competition remade the industry's economics entirely. The numbers reflect exactly what happened next. Total revolving debt in America stood at $48 billion in 1978. By 1985, that figure had climbed to $131 billion. By 2008, the Federal Reserve put it at $992 billion. 30 years of uncapped interest rates, and one Supreme Court decision had quietly made it all possible. By the 1990s and early 2000s, the credit card industry had developed a set of practices that weren't accidental oversights or edge cases. They were profit centers, engineered to extract the maximum amount of money from the people least positioned to push back. Universal default was one of the worst. A single late payment on any account, even one completely unrelated to your credit card, gave every issuer you held a card with permission to raise your interest rate on every balance, including accounts you've been paying perfectly on time for years. The punishment wasn't proportional to the behavior because proportion wasn't the point. Double-cycle billing compounded the problem by calculating interest charges using the average of the last 2 months' balances rather than the current one, which meant cardholders could pay off a balance in full and still owe interest on money they no longer had. Deceptive payment allocation worked quietly in the background. When you made a payment, banks applied it to your lowest interest balance first, leaving high-interest balances like cash advances sitting untouched and compounding while the 0% promotional balance got paid down. Due dates shifted from month to month with no requirement to notify cardholders in advance, turning even careful, organized people into accidental late payers who then owed fees for missing a deadline that had moved without warning. And throughout all of it, banks carried no legal obligation to tell cardholders what making only the minimum payment would actually cost them over time. They weren't required to disclose that a $6,000 balance paid down at the minimum rate could keep a person in debt for nearly 2 decades, generating almost as much in interest charges as the original amount borrowed. On college campuses, credit card companies set up tables and handed out free pizza, t-shirts, and frisbees to students who signed up for cards. Young people with no income, no credit history, and no financial education were the target precisely because they hadn't yet learned what to watch out for. None of this was accidental. These were features of the product, not flaws in it. On May 22, 2009, President Obama signed the Credit Card Accountability, Responsibility, and Disclosure Act, and for consumers, it delivered real relief in several areas. Universal default was banned. Double-cycle billing was banned. Predatory marketing on college campuses was prohibited. Banks now had to apply payments to the highest interest balance first, and every monthly statement had to show cardholders exactly how long it would take to pay off their balance if they made only the minimum payment each month. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau estimated the law had reduced credit card fees by more than $16 billion in the years following its passage, and average late fees dropped from $35 to $27. But the one protection consumers wanted most, a cap on interest rates, never made it into the final law. Banks retained the right to charge penalty interest rates on late accounts, and those rates, freed from state usury limits since 1978, kept moving upward. Between the first quarter of 2009 and the end of 2012, average credit card interest rates actually rose, climbing from 16.2% to 18.5%. The Card Act cleaned up the most egregious practices and left the underlying economics of the industry completely intact. By the fourth quarter of 2025, total U.S. credit card debt had reached $1.277 trillion, and that number carries context that makes it harder to set aside. Credit card balances rose by $507 billion between early 2021 and late 2025, a 66% increase in roughly 5 years, and Americans now carry $350 billion more in credit card debt than the previous all-time record set before the pandemic. The average individual balance stands at $6,523. The average household carries $11,303. Generation X, Americans between 44 and 59, holds the highest average balance at $9,557 per person. The average interest rate on all credit cards sits at 20.97%, and for new card offers the average runs even higher at 23.72%. Back in 2020, the average was 16.28%, meaning rates have climbed nearly 35% in 5 years, while wages haven't kept pace. Banks, for their part, have done well. The spread between what banks pay to borrow money and what they charge consumers in interest sat at 8.2% in 2007 and had expanded to 17.1% by the end of 2025. Credit card issuers earned over $130 billion in interest and fees in 2022 alone. About 3 in 5 cardholders carrying a balance have been in debt for at least a year, up from 53% in late 2024, and 21% have been carrying that debt for at least 5 years. Nearly 1 in 5 says they don't believe they'll ever get out. If you make only the minimum payment on the average balance of $6,523 at 19% APR, You'd be paying for 170 months and spend nearly $6,500 in interest on top of the original amount, essentially buying the same purchases twice over. Ted Rossman, a senior industry analyst at Bankrate, described the divide plainly. You have roughly half of cardholders paying in full and getting great benefits like rewards and buyer protections. And then you have the other half, more or less, who can easily become trapped in an expensive debt cycle. The rewards that affluent cardholders collect each month are effectively subsidized by the interest paid by the people who can't afford to pay in full, and that arrangement sits at the structural center of how the industry makes its money. A forgotten wallet in 1949 sparked an experiment. That experiment was mailed, unsolicited, to 65,000 households in Fresno, and the chaos it caused was cleaned up quietly while the banks pretended otherwise. The mailings spread until more than 100 million unsolicited cards had reached American households. Women and minorities were locked out of the system until federal law forced the doors open. A Supreme Court ruling in 1978, noticed by almost nobody at the time, let banks escape state interest rate limits permanently. States raced to attract those banks by dismantling their own consumer protections. The industry spent decades running plays designed to maximize debt and drag out repayment. A reform law in 2009 stopped the worst of it but left interest rates untouched. And now Americans carry $1.277 trillion in credit card debt, at an average rate approaching 21%, while nearly 1 in 5 cardholders says they don't believe they'll ever pay it off. The credit card didn't trap people by accident. The trap was built deliberately, piece by piece, across 75 years, and understanding how it was constructed is the first step toward deciding whether you want to stay inside it.